Hello, I'm Gokul and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be discussing the cerebellum. The word cerebellum is Latin for little brain and is named rightfully so. Cerebellum does look like a miniature version of the brain as it protrudes from the inferior and posterior region of the cerebral cortex. Although the cerebellum is involved in a multitude of neurological functions, it's best known for its modulation of movement. Whenever we make a voluntary movement, the signal to initiate that movement originates in the motor cortices, which are highlighted in blue on the left diagram. Before the signal is sent to our muscles, however, it is first sent to the cerebellum. In addition to receiving information about the planned movement from the motor cortex, the cerebellum also gets its information about the position of the body from our spinal cord. It then integrates this information and uses this information to coordinate the movement and allows us to make it in a smooth manner while maintaining our balance and bodily equilibrium. For example, let's imagine you're standing up and there's a piece of cake on the table in front of you. A plan to reach for the cake originates in the motor cortex. But in order for that plan to result in that fluid movement, a number of things have to happen. For example, the movement must be executed with the current position of the body in mind. For example, if you're standing stably on 2 feet, the action would require a different motor plan than, say, if you're trying to balance on 1 foot. Also, muscles that oppose the movement must be inhibited. If if not done properly, your attempt to extend your arm to grab that piece of cake might be negated by the muscles whose role is to flex your arm instead. When the cerebellum receives information about the motor plan from the motor cortices, it incorporates what it knows about the position of the body and muscles, which it gets from the spinal cord, and then it sends the movement plan back to the motor cortex to put it into action. As you reach for the cake, however, there will be a number of small corrections and adjustments that must be made to your hand movement along the way. Although to us our movements may seem like they're made up of large components, like reaching and grasping for the cake, in the brain they're actually made up of several small increments of movement. The plan for each increment of movement is developed based on the results of the previous increment of movement. In other words, when you reach for the cake, your brain is constantly getting data about the position of your hand and arm in real time and then using that data to make minor adjustments that you don't realize to the movement as it occurs. This results in a fluid, solid movement. Plus, the movement of our arm is made up of a number of smaller movements that involve slight deviations and then return to the originally designated course. It's in many ways similar to the approach an airplane uses to get from its destination, from its takeoff place to its destination. For example, New York to San Francisco. Although the course between the two cities seem to be straightforward, there are a number of unknown variables such as wind and weather, and as a result of this, the route between two cities will never be the same. Whenever a particular trip is examined closely, one will see that the plane frequently deviates from its designated path and then returns to its original path. Similarly, your brain must get information about where your arm is in space from your spinal cord, and if it's not on the mark designated by the path that it made beforehand, it will make smaller adjustments so that your movement will be fluid and exactly correct. These corrections are happening on the order of milliseconds, so you don't even realize that they're happening, and they're unconscious, and the cerebellum is essential to making them happen. Whenever the cerebellum detects any potential deviations from the route originally planned, it uses this information to send a modified plan back to your motor cortex. This corrected plan is what's used to generate the next increment of movement in reaching for the cake. In this way, the cerebellum provides an error detection mechanism for your movement. This allows our movement to appear smooth, precise, and coordinated. The importance of the cerebellum in facilitating smooth movement can especially be seen in someone who has experienced cerebral damage. They may develop cerebellar ataxia, which involves problem not in the initiation but the execution of the movement. Their movements and walking style are often abnormally timed and jerky. They are riddled with tremors. The cerebellum also seems to be important in the learning of motor control and movements. Whenever we learn a motor movement over and over again, we gradually learn to execute it more smoothly and precisely. This is often colloquially termed motor memory. This learning process is based in part of the strengthening of synapses in the cerebellum. And say someone experiences cerebellar damage due to a stroke, they may also display cognitive and emotional disturbances or deficits. Thus, there appears to be more to the cerebellum than just meets the eye, and more functions than just movement. However, due to the distinctive movement disorders that often appear when someone experiences cerebellar damage, its capacity to promote smooth and coordinated movement is the most widely accepted um, function of the cerebellum and what it's best known for. Now we'll get to the anatomy of the cerebellum. The cerebellum consists of two different cerebral hemispheres and can be divided into three distinct parts: the cerebellum, the vestibulocerebellum, and the spinal cerebellum. The cerebellum receives input from the cerebral cortex and is involved in planning and initiating movements. The spinal cerebellum receives information about limb position and touch and pressure sensations from the spinal cord. The spinal cerebellum then uses this information, for example, to compare where a limb is in space and to compare where it is to where it should be as if the movement was originally planned. If there is a discrepancy between where the arm is now and where the arm is supposed to be, the spinal cerebellum can modify motor signals to correct any errors in the movement. The vermis is the area of the spinal cerebellum that runs along the midline of the cerebellum. The vermis is involved in posture, correcting posture, limb movement, and even eye movements. The vestibulocerebellum is also known as the flocculonodular lobe and is important to maintaining equilibrium and bodily balance. It is also important in correcting one's posture. The cerebellum communicates with the rest of the nervous system through three large pathways called the cerebellar peduncles, which include the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. When information is first sent to the cerebellum, it takes an indirect path to reach extensively branched cells called Purkinje cells. These Purkinje cells then project to a group of nuclei in the center of the cerebellum called the deep cerebellar nuclei. The deep cerebellar nuclei then send this information to various areas in the brainstem and thalamus that can then influence motor areas of the cortex or the descending motor tracts to modify movements. Thank you.